We want to turn our attention now to German idealism and keep in mind the overall structure of modern thought that we've represented by those two intersecting lines. That is to say that we have a tradition of continental rationalism represented by Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz, which, after Kant, leads into the German idealist tradition. And if you wonder what the point of connection is, it's on the emphasis on the self. In the rationalists, it is, of course, the emphasis on a priori knowledge, that is to say, the inner intellectual resources of the self, the inner rationality of the self. And then the self gets even greater importance in the development of German idealism. Of course, we have as well the British empiricist tradition represented by Locke, Berkeley and Hume, which leads into 19th century positivism and empiricism that we'll meet in people like John Stuart Mill, and then in the 20th century with Bertrand Russell and logical positivism and so on and so forth. From here on out, what we're doing is simply following these two trends. So we'll follow the European trend all the way up into the 20th century to Jean-Paul Sartre and beyond. And then we'll back up and follow the empiricist trend from Bentham and Mill way up again into 1950 and since. So we'll structure it that way. Keep in mind as well the overall timeline of this other diagram, hopefully is familiar enough by now, a plurality of worldviewish traditions developing through the course of history. Worldviewish traditions that you might label theism, naturalism, pantheism, or something of that sort. And each of them profoundly influenced by, shaped by, the scientific models that have developed in the history of science. Where the first, of course, representing Greek science, Pythagorean or Aristotelian, lays emphasis on the objective reality of form, fixity of species, and so forth, therefore. Teleological worldview. The second, with mechanistic science, losing the teleology, simply a fixed mechanical order of matter and cause-effect mechanisms. But then, as we mentioned last time, around 1800 or a bit before, you begin to get the rise of historical science and biological science, both of which concerned with developmental process. And so the third kind of scientific model that has come to characterize the 19th and most of the 20th century is of a more organic sort, rather than mechanistic. Organic in the sense of the intertwined interrelationships. Everything connected with everything else in some organic fashion. And with the notion of historical process, developmental process, running right through it. So we'll be talking about German idealism this week and next week a little bit, and then picking up with some other 19th century developments, Feuerbach, touch of Marx, that sort of thing. But then right after spring break, we'll be getting into process philosophy like Alfred North Whitehead. And I might mention now that we're done with outlining. But if you've done it in Kant, you've learned how to do it. You've learned how to read philosophy. So as we get to Whitehead and thereafter, we'll be reading paperback classics, selected paperback classics. And I'll be asking, and I'll give you more specifics later on, I'll be asking for book reviews rather than outlines. So you'll get a chance to identify the thesis of the book. This week you're working on a thesis statement for Hegel's selections. We'll go after the thesis of the book and the steps by which the thesis is developed, and an evaluation of how effective is the development philosophically. Okay. So we'll take the reading philosophy that much further for that remaining quad. But keep in mind this framework so that you can see that things are going to take different shape. Now, what we want to do, therefore, is to get some overall characterization, first of all, of German idealism. What is it about? And what this diagram indicates that I'm just erasing, that historical grid, what that indicates is that the German idealists are rejecting and reacting against the ultimacy of mechanistic science. That is to say, they do not believe that the mechanistic science of the Newtonian tradition tells us the nature of reality. They will have a phenomenalist view as far as the mechanistic interpretation of nature is concerned. It's talking about appearance, it's not about reality. The underlying reality is more of an organic than a mechanical sort. It's more of a developmental process than of a static order, you'll say. The static order that never changes. No, it's a developmental process in which there is change. So one thing you can keep in mind then is that 19th century idealism is going to be a metaphysics of change, a metaphysics of process. And it's the root out of which later there grows 20th century process philosophy and process theology, which some of you may be aware of. So it's a reaction against mechanistic science. Now, there have been other reactions against mechanistic science that we've already taken in our stride. Three kinds of reaction, I think. One, which says that there must be exceptions to the mechanistic law. Descartes took that point of view. The mind is an exception to the causal mechanisms that rule everything else, because mind has free will. Scottish realists take that point of view. John Locke seems to take that point of view. Secondly, there's a complete rejection of mechanistic philosophy as not telling us the nature of reality. Leibniz is there. Leibniz is there. His monadology is more of a teleological scheme. And in that sense, Leibniz is some sort of an anticipation of what's coming later in the 19th century. Because we get in this idealist movement a renewal of the teleological picture of nature and of history. It is end-oriented, end-achieving. There is potency that is being actualized in the process. Then you get the phenomenalist reaction of people like Berkeley and Kant, saying that mechanistic science tells us about appearance but not about reality. So you get those three other kinds of reaction which we've already taken in our stride. Well, now comes the idealist, and what it is doing, of course, is riding piggyback on the earlier phenomenalist view of science, and particularly on the influence of Kant. So keep that in mind, first of all, the reaction against mechanistic science. Second, it's also a reaction against the dogmatic rationalistic metaphysics of the 17th century. The kind of foundationalist approach that Descartes initiated with his first principles and thence deductive reasoning all the way until you've got the whole system worked out. No, that sort of process, that sort of methodology, may have been appropriate when you thought that this was a strictly mathematically ordered universe, a mathematical method fitting a mathematical universe. But if what you have is a developmental, organic kind of process, then you need a different kind of method. And here we'll notice it is Kant's transcendental method that is the key. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. A transcendental method. Third, these German idealists are continuing Kant's Copernican revolution. And that immediately rides on the notion of a transcendental method that focuses on the constructive contribution of the self. You see. Kant's Copernican revolution. That is to say, the key to reality, the key to understanding reality, is the role of the self, the role of the subjective self, the human spirit. Now, I said that Kant leads you into Romanticism. Well, here it is. The role of the creative self. But this comes in different ways, and you might think of it as the viewer here, the observer, the thinker, whatever, looking through the lens of his, her own self-consciousness at the screen of reality as a whole. So from this standpoint, you see things through what the self-consciousness of the human spirit provides. Put it another way, if we can, with the transcendental method, uncover, beneath all of the particulars of human experience, the underlying essence of what self-consciousness is, of what the self is, then we can, in that light, see the reality, as it were, the reality of the whole, projected on the screen. Have you played with making shadow images in the dark? Did you do that as a kid with a flashlight in your bed? Where you would shine a light on the ceiling and make some sort of crazy figure with your fingers, and you'd get a projected huge image there? Well, you can think what Hegel is doing is making those sorts of images. You see. Projecting an image of the self on the reality as a whole. If you like, creating the universe in the image of the self. Creating the whole of reality in one's own image. The key to reality is one's own self-consciousness. Now, if that is the case, it's going to follow that the structures of human consciousness are also the structures of reality. Or to put it in Kantian language, the categories of understanding are the categories of reality. Oh, you're breaking the phenomenal-noumenal distinction. Right. You see. If there is indeed some sort of a pre-formation whereby the forming of the self is in the image of reality, you see, then by understanding the structures of the self, we can understand the structures of reality. And that's precisely what these people are trying to do. So the transcendental method is an attempt to provide a description of the process of self-understanding or self-consciousness, so that the development of the self-consciousness is a microcosm of the development of the consciousness of the absolute spirit, the all-inclusive ground of being. You see? And immediately I say that, you begin to see that this idealism is going to be a monistic idealism. There is one all-inclusive ground of being, you see, of which the self-consciousness is simply a microcosm. Now, let me back up with one more statement there. This may help. Back up to this. We've observed, during the modern period from Descartes on, and culminating in Kant, the ongoing question about the nature of the self. What am I? Oh, a thinking thing. Well, Locke isn't so sure. Hume finds only a bundle of perceptions with nothing to unify it. Kant finds that there is this synthetic unity of apperception, whereby there is some sort of unification of the field of consciousness. And the schematization of the understanding brings the unification of the whole of one's experience and thinking. But you notice that that is not an underlying substantive entity that is the unified self. It is the structuring of consciousness that is the unifier. Right? It's the structuring of the consciousness that's the unifier. Now that's the point of departure for the German idealists. They're not looking for some mind substance, some soul substance in the Cartesian sense. They're not looking for immortal souls in the Platonic sense that have some eternal pre-existence and so on and so forth. No. What they're doing is trying to understand the self as structured self-consciousness. You see? That's the notion of the self. What is it that unifies all of the diversities of experience? What is the unifying action of the self? How are you going to characterize this self-consciousness? And as you see from what I've written on the board, if self-consciousness is the key to reality, and the question is, well, what is the essential, central, fundamental characteristic of self-consciousness, of which everything else is just a function or a byproduct? Then you get 4 different answers. In Fechter, moral consciousness. He takes off from the critique of practical reason. In Schelling, it's what Kant calls the teleological. In the critique of judgment, the aesthetic consciousness. Schelling is the major philosopher of German Romanticism. For Schleiermacher, Friedrich Schleiermacher, it's the religious consciousness. And Schleiermacher is the great 19th century theologian building his theology as a projection of religious experience. If you like, romanticism in theology. He's a romanticist theologian. And what Hegel does is simply to say, no, it's this conceptual capacity that we have. The ongoing process of trying to grasp the concept of being itself. That's what marks the developing consciousness. So in trying to grasp more and more fully the concept of myself, I'm grasping more and more fully the concept of being itself, the totality. So you have to distinguish between the finite self and the absolute self. Absolute in the sense of the one all-inclusive ground of being. Okay, and this is where the phrase ground of being begins to pick up. You find it in Schleiermacher and Hegel and so forth. Okay, now, let me pause there for a question, comment. Kristen?
Oh, you guys have questions.
I figured I might, that's why I kept going.
Is the hinge point to all these, or it seems to me that one of the hinge points of all these idealists is that there is some sort of unity within the self?
Yeah, the emphasis here is on the unity of the self. And immediately you've got a unified, all-inclusive one, absolute self. Yeah. So what you get here is a monistic idealism, a monistic metaphysic, everything is ultimately one, yeah? Built in this image. Right, the unity of the self.
How is that different from, why do you say monistic as opposed to pantheistic?
Well, the term monism is simply saying reality is one all-inclusive being. Pantheistic is the religious shape that would take, identifying the one as God. Now, the term pantheism, you'll find, may be a little too heavy-handed for these guys, particularly for Hegel, who isn't happy with pantheism. But the term panentheism is perhaps more applicable. Now, the difference is the little Greek preposition en, which means in. So rather than saying everything is God and God is everything is in God, you say, but the totality of finite things does not exhaust the totality of God. There is room for more process. Yeah. Pantheism in Spinoza has a static universe. It has a mechanistic, static order. This is a dynamic, open-ended teleological process. David? No, say that again. I'm not quite sure I got the question. Yes, yes. Yeah, in Kant, the unity of the self, which is this theme, okay, in Kant, the unity of the self is not found simply by listing forms and categories, but is found in terms of what he calls that synthetic unity, notice the term, synthetic unity of apperception. You'll see. And then the schematization of the 12 categories in relationship to the form of time. Now, notice in both cases, both the synthetic unity and the schematization, this is a functional unity. The self is unified in action, you see, not in just being, but in thinking, in experiencing. That's why I say self-consciousness. You see. And I think that's important to notice that it's a functional unity, we're functionally unified, because what is the unifying factor in the self-consciousness in these cases? Well, this is the functional unity, these are the functional units. You see. It's those functions which unify, respectively for a particular philosophy. Reflect back into John Locke and his discussion of personal identity. You see, what is it which gives unity of the self through a period of time for Locke? And his answer is simply memory. That is to say, the past experiences which are associated with, in my present experience, my present memory of the past. You see, so that too is sort of a functional unity. And it's a somewhat speculative thing that he, as to whether there is an underlying soul substance, he'd rather think so, but can't prove it as clearly as Descartes thought he could. So this notion of functional unity, I think, is important. Yeah. Okay, anything else there? Let me sum this up then. What we're going to find is first a new scientific model, more organic and developmental. If you like, evolutionary, because of course evolutionary theory came in with the developmental biology. Developmental biology is at both the micro and the macro level. At the micro level, the beginnings of genetics. The macro level, evolutionary biology. But a new scientific model, developmental. A new philosophical method that begins with the transcendental method, but comes to be referred to as a phenomenological method. Phenomenology, that's the method. What is the title of Hegel's major work? The Phenomenology of Mind. The Phenomenology of Mind. And what is the dominant European philosophy in the 20th century? It is phenomenology, a methodological approach. It's the method underlying existentialism, underlying hermeneutical theory, and so forth. Now, watch this term, phenomenology. It is not the same as phenomenalism, and a moment's reflection will help you see why some of you who've been using the terms interchangeably were not thinking. There's a difference between an ism and a logy. An ism is a position.